The day they unveiled the new leadership, every seat in the boardroom was taken, except one. The one they said wasn't mine. Someone handed me coffee but not a chair. Smiles were polite, patronizing, as if I should feel lucky to witness the decisions. What they didn't know was, the woman without a seat had already bought the building. The boardroom smelled like fresh leather, burnt espresso, and generational entitlement. The kind of air that clung to suits tailored in London and opinions sharpened in Ivy League debate clubs. The chair I'd requested, formally, professionally, weeks ago, had mysteriously been overlooked. So I stood, next to the coffee cart, behind the line of men whose voices would echo into the minutes. My name wasn't on a placard. My role wasn't listed on the agenda. My presence was observational, an internal courtesy, the kind that comes after years of overperformance and under-recognition. They called it a leadership strategy session, a round table of visionaries, but what I saw, more than anything, was a closed loop. Their table, circular in theory, had sharp edges, and no room for someone like me. When I first walked in, the receptionist glanced at my heels before my face. "Deliveries go to the freight entrance," she said. That was the costume I wore now. Quiet success, minimalist power. No logos, no loudness, just intention, and a plan. Because what they didn't know, what no one in that glossy glass building knew, was that the company they believed they ran had been quietly acquired by a holding firm. One they'd never heard of. One built from silent partnerships, discreet buyouts, and meticulously structured investments. One I created, piece by piece. During all the nights they left me out of happy hour, off the invite chain, out of the conversation. The seat they refused to offer, I designed it in mahogany, with a brass plaque, and a key. But let me rewind. Before the contracts, before the whispers, before the escrow wires, and the new shareholder ledger, there was another meeting, a smaller one, where they told me I was not quite boardroom material, too operational, too junior, too soft-spoken. I remember that phrase because I heard it twice, once from the CFO and once from my mentor, a woman, who'd learned that to survive at the top, she had to close the door behind her. They thought I was grateful just to be in the room, but I wasn't there to listen. I was there to watch them fail a test they didn't know they were taking. They talked numbers. I listened to tone. They named names. I watched who smiled, who flinched. They plotted the company's future without knowing it wasn't theirs anymore. The PowerPoint clicked forward. "Next slide," said the chairman, smug. "New investment group enters this quarter. Final terms pending." Heads tilted, brows furrowed. The logo on the slide? Unfamiliar. Clean. Minimalist. Exactly how I designed it. They mumbled questions. Who are they? Where's this group based? Are we being bought out? The legal counsel looked confused. He hadn't seen this version of the deck. I had, because I commissioned it and sent it from a private address routed through Zurich. Subject line: confirmation of controlling interest. Evergreen table partners. I've always liked irony. The chairman adjusted his tie. My assistant must have uploaded the wrong deck. No, she hadn't. Kelly never made mistakes. Not since I hired her. I stepped forward. Not aggressively. Just enough to make them look. My voice didn't rise. "Actually," I said, "the slide is accurate." Every head turned. "This investment group," I continued, gesturing to the logo now casting shadows across the boardroom wall, "finalized its acquisition last week. The ink is dry. The funding cleared. The assets, board seats, and executive rights, all transferred." Silence. Then, "You're from that group?" I smiled. "I am that group." No one reached for their coffee. No one blinked. Because everything they believed, about ownership, about power, about who deserved a seat, collapsed in that single sentence. I had become the thing they never expected. Not just qualified, not just prepared, but untouchable. They didn't blacklist me. They didn't even fire me. They did something worse. They made me small. Not with insults, not with slurs. That would have been too obvious, too easy to call out. No, they did it with precision, with corporate compliments soaked in quiet contempt. "You're so organized. You're great in the weeds. You'd be perfect for project support." I was the woman they looped in late, the name buried in the CC line, the one they thanked for the slide deck, but never invited to the actual call. And when I raised my hand, Not physically, of course, because we were professionals, but when I submitted ideas, when I questioned models, when I suggested strategy, they paused, and then they pivoted. Let's circle back. Maybe table that for now. Or my favorite, that's outside your scope, but we appreciate the initiative. Appreciate. As in, pat on the head. As in, stay in your lane. As in, know your place. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't dramatic. I played by every rule they claimed to value. Prepared, sharp, early to every meeting. I didn't make waves. I made results. But results weren't what got you invited to that table. Not if you didn't look like the last 10 who sat there. Not if you didn't have the right degree, the right sponsor, the right last name, etched into donor plaques at their alma maters. They said I was not quite executive material. When I asked why, they used the words that still sting. You're just not what leadership looks like. What does leadership look like? Apparently not like me. Not like the daughter of a public school teacher and a mechanic. Not like someone who put herself through college by working night shifts at a hotel front desk. Not like someone who didn't summer abroad, but summered under fluorescent lights filing invoices for someone else's legacy. I remember the exact moment I stopped trying to belong. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was Tuesday. The head of product, Greg, presented my model at a director's meeting. Word for word. The same spreadsheet, the same market assumptions, even the footnote I added about demographic shifts. I wasn't in the room. Later that afternoon, I walked past his office. He was accepting praise like it was his birthright. I paused, just long enough to hear, "She's smart, just needs guidance." That night, I didn't cry. I built. I poured a glass of wine and opened a new doc. A framework, a shell company, a blank cap table. It looked like nothing. It was everything. Because while they were busy mentoring each other's sons, I was writing the articles of incorporation for what would become Evergreen Table Partners. The holding firm that would one day own the building they still thought belonged to them. I didn't need their title. I needed time, and silence, and to stay underestimated, just a little longer. I let them think they were winning. Let them ignore me in elevators. Let them call me by the wrong name. Let them believe that invisibility was failure, not fuel. They didn't know that the girl who wasn't leadership material was building something they couldn't audit, couldn't measure, couldn't dilute. A web of ownership they'd never untangle until it was too late. And the most poetic part? I used their own advice. All those hours sitting in on their presentations, listening to how real players build capital flows, how legacy families protect their assets. I took notes. They gave me the blueprint. I just didn't tell them I'd be using it to build a fortress. So when they smiled that tight smile and said, "We'll keep you in mind for future opportunities," I smiled back. Because I already owned their future. They didn't steal my ideas because they were desperate. They stole them because they assumed I wouldn't do anything about it. And for a while I didn't. I let Greg pitch my framework in front of the board like he'd come up with it during a morning jog. I watched Karen recycle my hiring strategy in a diversity committee meeting and present it like it had come to her in a dream. I listened as Derek mispronounced my name during a global summit, while quoting from a report I authored alone at 2 a.m. during flu season. It didn't hurt. Not anymore. Because I had learned something about power. It's not just who talks the loudest. It's who writes the contracts. I stopped waiting to be invited, stopped refreshing my inbox for a seat at tables built to exclude me, and I started collecting signatures, quietly, efficiently, legally. Shell companies became shields. Investment vehicles became vaults. Each document filed under a name they didn't know belonged to me. Evergreen Table Partners wasn't created to punish them. It was built to protect me, to insulate my assets from the whims of people who mistook nepotism for intelligence, to ensure that one day, when they tried to push me out of the room, I'd already owned the floor beneath their feet. But even empires start with paper cuts. Mine began with an HR file. I requested my personnel review, out of curiosity more than strategy. What I found wasn't shocking. It was surgical, highly capable, but lacks executive presence, detail-oriented, but may struggle with big-picture vision. Valuable team player, not yet ready for leadership trajectory. I read those phrases like tombstones. Buried behind each line was a quiet gatekeeping ritual, designed to keep women like me in the waiting room of ambition. So I stopped waiting. That same week, I scheduled 3 meetings with mid-tier founders in sectors adjacent to ours. They were smart, scrappy, undercapitalized. Perfect. I offered them capital in exchange for equity and a condition. Don't disclose your investors. Ever. They agreed. And just like that, I had my first strategic foothold in a market the company's board had just publicly dismissed as non-viable. My name wasn't on the agenda, but my influence was already in the room. It slipped in through data partnerships, through vendor contracts, through competitors they hadn't bothered to vet. Every time they said my name wrong, I added another name to the board of one of my subsidiaries. Every time they forwarded a deck to the wrong Allison, I forwarded term sheets to my lawyer. Every time they ignored my ideas, I licensed them elsewhere. They were building resumes. I was building leverage. The morning they held a quarterly offsite and forgot to include me in the planning, I sent flowers to the venue under a pseudonym. The card read, "To the architects of short-term thinking, thank you for the blueprint." No one understood the joke, but it wasn't for them. It was for me. The kind of private satisfaction that tastes better than praise. Because praise is conditional. Ownership isn't. When the company announced a new round of board appointments, the email subject line read, "The future of leadership. 6 new names. None of them mine." I read it in silence. Then I called Marcus. "I'm ready," I said. "I want controlling interest. Not majority. Control." He paused. "You'll need to move in layers." "I already have." I sent him the structure. 12 LLCs, 5 trusts, 3 offshore holdings. "Jesus," he whispered. "You planned this like a hostile takeover." "No," I corrected. "I planned it like a woman who stopped asking for permission. While they used to call me kid, sometimes star intern. The kind of compliments meant to be endearing, but always just slightly beneath you. At 22, I was the girl who remembered birthdays, ordered team lunches, and stayed late, just to help. At 28, I was still the one taking notes in meetings where I knew more than the speaker. By 30, I had memorized the blueprint of how the company functioned. Not the mission statements they plastered on office walls, but the true mechanics. Who really approved what? Which vendors padded invoices, which VPs were over-leveraged, and which executives never read their own decks. I was invisible in all the ways that made me dangerous. They underestimated how carefully I watched them, how I turned their condescension into curriculum. When they sent me to refill coffee during meetings, I listened. When they copied me on contract drafts just to loop you in, I archived everything. I became fluent in legal structures, profit and loss shadows, cap tables, equity freezes, and golden parachutes. And I learned in silence. My official title never changed. Associate, senior associate, director in name only. But my real work happened elsewhere, in the shadow files, in the margins. In a Gmail account they didn't know existed, where I sketched out what would become the first draft of an empire. The first company I bought, I did under the name of my aunt, legally, quietly. She thought it was just an investment. It was more than that. It was a test. Would they notice a small competitor being absorbed? Would anyone on the acquisitions team flag it? They didn't. That's when I knew I could move without being seen. From there, it accelerated. A graphic design firm, a data analytics consultancy, a logistics partner that handled half of their supply chain during Q3, all acquired through subsidiaries. Each acquisition was a move on the chessboard they didn't realize they were standing on. I stayed in the office, smiling at birthdays, attending all-hands meetings with lukewarm enthusiasm, nodding at town halls led by men who assumed I was still finding my way. What they didn't know was that the intern they once asked to fetch lattes was now one document away from being their landlord. By the time I turned 35, I had created 12 companies, not in name, but in structure, each with clean books, each run by someone I trusted, each masked by layers of LLCs and limited partnerships that trace back to a single point of control. Me. No yachts, no flashy purchases. I lived in a modest loft with concrete floors and intentional minimalism. My closet looked like an algorithm. Neutrals, flats, clean lines. I didn't need to announce myself, because power that needs attention is just noise, and I had become quiet thunder. The shift happened slowly. A VP moved to a startup I owned stock in. An executive consultant shared confidential forecasts with a boutique firm I co-founded. Their decisions started being shaped by hands they couldn't trace. I wasn't hiding. I had simply made myself invisible in all the ways that mattered. They still thought I was mid-tier, middle talent, modestly impressive. They thought I'd peaked with my promotion to Director of Strategic Ops, a role with no direct reports and no budget authority. And I let them believe it, because in truth, I had direct influence over far more than any org chart could show. I once had dinner with the CFO, a polite, empty meal, where he explained the future of digital transformation while I nodded and took mental inventory of the vendor accounts I'd already acquired. He told me I was too nice to play hardball. I smiled. He was eating on my tableware, in a restaurant partially owned by my holding company. The beauty of becoming incognito is not just in being underestimated, it's in being untraceable. While they looked for ambition in loudness, in speeches, in panel events and profile features, I built in silence. No press, no social footprint, no traceable ego, only paper, signed, sealed, irrevocable. I wasn't just playing the game anymore. I had rewritten the rules. They always assumed I was in the building, that if I wasn't at my desk, I must be grabbing coffee or running a report. They never imagined I was 15 floors above them, signing contracts that would make them obsolete. Because to them, I was part of the scenery, the quiet girl who took stairs instead of elevators, the one who typed quickly and spoke slowly, the one who wore flats to board meetings and never drank more than one glass at networking events. I was safe, predictable, passive, and that illusion gave me freedom. Freedom to disappear into meetings they never asked about. Freedom to sit across from lawyers and founders and advisory firms without raising suspicion. Freedom to build leverage in plain sight. They never noticed my calendar had recurring entries marked vendor audit. They never asked what consultation offsite meant or why my badge showed building access on weekends. The meetings they cared about were the loud ones. The ones with steak lunches, keynote speakers, name tags printed in bold font. But power rarely grows in loud rooms. It germinates in the quiet. My real meetings were in sterile conference rooms with lawyers who spoke in clause numbers, in nondescript cafes with founders whose startups I funded anonymously, in rented office spaces where I took meetings as E-March, the alias I used when setting up one of my earliest trusts, a name born from my grandmother's initials, and the month I realized no one was coming to save me. Through E-March, I became a phantom investor, a ghost on their ledgers, a shadow behind the curtain of their quarterly reports. Once, I sat in a pitch meeting with two men who'd been on panels mocking women-led firms as emotionally volatile. They had no idea the firm backing their bridge round was owned by me. They signed the term sheet, took the funding, and publicly thanked my lawyer. I stayed in the back of the room, smiling at their lack of curiosity. Another time, I was invited to a vendor strategy session by accident. Someone clicked the wrong Allison in the email chain. I attended anyway, listened to them outline plans to pivot from my employer's outdated systems toward a more agile, client-focused platform. They had no idea the platform they were switching to was mine. White-labeled, managed overseas, registered through a holding company in a jurisdiction they couldn't spell. They signed the migration agreement 2 weeks later. My employer lost the contract. I gained market share. They sent around an internal email blaming lack of innovation. I printed it out and framed it. There was poetry in their ignorance. They thought power was a title on a slide. But real power, the kind that moves money, people, influence, doesn't introduce itself. It signs the back of checks. It changes agendas. It rewrites narratives without raising its voice. Sometimes I'd sit in actual company meetings, surrounded by men drawing diagrams they barely understood, and marvel at how comfortable they were making decisions on incomplete information. They thought data was something you presented. I knew it was something you controlled. While they used dashboards, I built the pipelines. While they debated margins, I negotiated the back end that determined pricing structures. And when they launched a major cross-collaboration campaign without inviting me, I didn't protest. I bought the media company running their digital placement, then rerouted their campaign analytics through my infrastructure. By the time they figured out their metrics didn't match their budget, I had already spun the results into a white paper, one that positioned my firm as the more effective partner. They published it in an industry journal. They quoted it in strategy sessions. They never knew it was mine. I didn't need credit. I needed control. And the difference between those two is the difference between asking for a seat and owning the table. The meetings they never noticed were the ones that built the staircase beneath my silence. Every unnoticed interaction, every ignored report, every condescending aside became a brick in the foundation. Until one day, I was no longer in the building. I was above it, not figuratively, literally. The penthouse suite that had once belonged to a hedge fund now housed evergreen table partners. My name wasn't on the door. It didn't need to be, because from that height, I didn't need an invitation to their meetings. They needed one to mine. Her name was Celia. She'd been with the company for 22 years, outlasting 4 CEOs, 2 mergers, and 1 attempted hostile takeover, the kind that ended with champagne and NDAs. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. She wasn't ever wrong. They called her a dinosaur behind her back, but I called her what she was, an archive with a pulse. She knew where the bodies were buried. More importantly, she knew who buried them, and in what suit they wore when they did it. Celia had the kind of memory that could reconstruct conversations from 2013 word for word. She remembered who was in the room, what they ordered for lunch, and which idea they took credit for. She'd seen enough golden boys rise and flame out to know how temporary charisma can be. She once told me, in passing, that the key to longevity wasn't likability. It was discretion. You make people feel like they're safe when they talk near you, she said. Then you listen hard enough to never need to ask again. I used to pass her desk every morning. Always the same ritual. A tight bun, a perfect blazer, and a calendar printed in triplicate. She knew everyone's birthday, partner's name, and vice, and she never forgot who spoke to her like she mattered. Most didn't. They said please, but not sincerely. They CC'd her on emails, but never used her name. They asked her to schedule meetings like she didn't understand the content inside them. But I always made a point to pause, not to flatter, to respect. I brought her coffee the week her mother passed. I covered for her when the interns were late, and she was visibly holding it together by a thread. I never called her just an assistant. And when I started building the first pieces of Evergreen, she noticed. She never said anything, just nodded slowly the day I asked her about a company name. Something neutral, something quietly global. She said, "Pick something that sounds like it's always been here. That's what men do when they want to sound important." I smiled. She didn't. Months later, I left a file on her desk by accident. Or maybe not. Inside was the early-stage blueprint, layered ownership charts, distributions, exit protections. 2 hours later, she knocked on my office door and closed it behind her. "You've been busy," she said, eyes calm, voice measured. "You trust anyone else with this?" "No," I said simply. She nodded. "I'll help you." Quietly. "As long as when this goes public, I don't get paraded out like a relic." "I don't do parades," I said. "Only press releases." That was the beginning of our unofficial alliance. She became my archive, my firewall, my quiet assassin with a calendar and a 4-digit pin to everything that mattered. She flagged inconsistencies in corporate filings. She created aliases for entities I hadn't yet named. She reminded me, softly, always, of which executives were teetering toward obsolescence. Celia knew what leverage looked like before it was called that. She was the one who noticed when procurement started spending against departments that didn't exist. She was the one who caught the early memo about the company downsizing non-essential strategic roles, which, surprise, included mine. She handed it to me without blinking. "Give them their 48 hours, she said. That phrase stayed with me, because she wasn't asking for pity. She was offering timing, a countdown, not a plea. They'd decided I was expendable, an operational risk in an ecosystem they no longer wanted to acknowledge. I didn't cry. I didn't protest. I simply accelerated. With Celia at my side, I rewrote the narrative. We backdated filings, formalized previously soft assets, and spun dormant trusts into active vehicles. She scheduled meetings with lawyers under the names of her grandchildren. She used her lunch hour to scan documents into folders they'd never know existed. She wasn't just helping me. She was preparing her own exit. When the acquisition was ready to be revealed, she was the first person I told. "I'll need you in the room," I said. "You're the only one who's actually earned it." She smiled, rare and full. "I don't need a seat," she said. "I just want to watch them realize who's been listening all these years." And so she did. The morning of the takeover, Celia didn't wear her blazer. She wore a silk blouse the color of unfinished business. She walked through the lobby like a woman who had seen too much to be impressed, and too little to be surprised. The men didn't acknowledge her. They never had. But when the signatures were inked and the names were changed, Celia stood next to me at the elevator, holding the original lease agreements. Signed, sealed, dated 10 years prior. I asked her how she kept them all these years. "I never throw away proof," she said. "It's the difference between memory and power." That's what Celia taught me. Memory is data. Power is how you use it. And the women they overlook the longest? We remember everything. It didn't happen in a boardroom. There was no clink of champagne flutes, no press release, no LinkedIn announcement. The deal that changed everything was signed in a sterile conference room with flickering lights, cheap carpet, and a broken clock stuck at 4:13, a detail that, in hindsight, felt almost prophetic, because that was the hour everything froze for them, even if they didn't know it yet. The man across from me wore a navy suit and a wedding ring he kept spinning with his thumb. He represented the family that still thought they owned the controlling stake in the company. He didn't look twice at me, just flipped through the documents, humming under his breath. Celia sat to my right, motionless, eyes fixed on the contract like it was sacred scripture. She didn't need to read the pages. She'd proofed them all the night before. The lawyer I hired, Marcus, was younger than they expected, sharper than they preferred, and far more expensive than I let on. He'd been orchestrating acquisitions for Fortune 100 since his late 20s. But this one, he said, had a special flavor. Because it's personal, he murmured, sliding the final page into place. And you never let them know it is. It took exactly 19 minutes, 3 signatures, 7 initialed clauses, 1 wire confirmation. And with that, Evergreen Table Partners officially absorbed the final remaining equity interest, which meant that, on paper, I didn't just control 51%. I controlled the board, the bylaws, the narrative, everything that had once belonged to them, the legacy office building, the intellectual property portfolio, even the leather chairs they loved to spin in during quarterly reviews, belonged to me now. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. Because true power doesn't celebrate early. It closes, quietly. They wouldn't find out until the following Monday, when the calendar invite landed in their inboxes. Emergency Strategic Realignment Meeting, 9 a.m., mandatory. They assumed it was another fire drill. Another empty corporate theater production. They didn't know I'd already rewritten the second act. The day after the deal was signed, I walked through the old executive suite. Technically, it was mine now. The security badge registered under Evergreen's authority. The doors unlocked without resistance. I stood in the center of that office. Marble desk, wall of diplomas, window overlooking a skyline they took for granted. And I didn't feel victorious. I felt ready. Ready to realign what leadership looked like. Ready to dismantle the architecture of exclusion one clause at a time. Ready to sit in the chair they never thought belonged to me. Not as a guest, but as the one who built the floor beneath it. I spent that weekend rereading every document we'd filed. Every transfer. Every resolution. Every acquisition timeline. Marcus had drafted them like a machine. Celia had cross-referenced every line. The result? Flawless. Unbreakable. Untraceable, unless you knew where to look. And none of them did. Because while they were busy refreshing dashboards and gaming bonus metrics, I'd been building a legal fortress, one clause at a time. I hadn't cut corners. I'd buried them. There was a moment, brief but real, where I considered telling them gently, offering them a transition plan, an olive branch. But then I remembered the closed doors, the interrupted sentences, the performance reviews that questioned my executive energy. I remembered being told I lacked gravitas, while I quietly managed vendor contracts worth more than the salaries of the men giving that feedback. I remembered what it felt like to sit on the wrong side of glass, looking in, always in. No, they didn't deserve gentle. They deserved the same silence they gave me, the silence of erasure. So I stayed silent. Let the papers speak. Let the transfer of ownership become their Monday morning thunderstorm. Let their confusion echo through the hallways I now owned. Let their disbelief ring out in Slack messages and hushed kitchen conversations. And when they asked who Evergreen was, Marcus would simply reply, "She's been here the whole time." They were late, not individually. No, each man arrived precisely when expected, by their own internal rhythms and routines. But late in the only way that mattered. They had already lost before they stepped through the door, and they had no idea. The boardroom looked exactly the same as it always had. Frosted glass, a 12-seat table made from repurposed walnut, filtered water in crystal pitchers, the company crest etched into the carpet, all curated, all performative. But the power in the room had shifted, subtly, entirely, because this time I wasn't waiting for a seat. I was the reason they were seated. At 9:01, Marcus stood from the end of the table. No gavel, no introduction. Just a leather-bound folder, a copy for each person, passed down like communion. They flipped pages with vague confusion, financial breakdowns, legal updates, organizational charts, and then, on page 13, a list of names, all new, effective immediately, Marcus said, his voice smooth as cashmere. This board will undergo strategic restructuring. Per the terms of the acquisition finalized last Friday, voting control has officially shifted to Evergreen Table Partners. The silence was delicious. Not loud, not shocked, dead. Until someone, Henry, I think, tried to laugh. "That's not possible," he said, leaning back in his chair like a man confident in outdated maps. "We'd have been notified. This kind of transfer requires—" "Notice was sent," Marcus interrupted. 3 times. Via certified mail. E-signed, tracked, logged. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The documents had already spoken. A hand shot up. "Mark, VP of Risk. Who is Evergreen Table Partners?" That was my cue. I stood, slowly. Not dramatically, just enough for posture to become punctuation. "I am," I said, and the room finally breathed. They looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time. Not because I had changed, but because the lens through which they viewed me had shattered. The intern, the assistant, the quiet girl in flats. No longer theoretical, no longer forgettable. I wasn't a consultant. I wasn't part of the new leadership team. I was the leadership team. "Let me clarify," I said, voice steady. "I founded Evergreen Table Partners. I own its controlling interest, which means, as of this morning, I own you." You could almost hear their egos recalibrating. Henry's mouth opened and closed. Mark turned red. A few leaned back in their chairs as if physical distance could buffer psychological collapse. "Impossible," someone muttered. But it wasn't. Because while they were busy guarding the front door of power, I had bought the foundation. While they obsessed over quarterly optics, I structured long-term silence. While they forgot I existed, I quietly made sure that forgetting me would be the costliest mistake of their careers. "You'll find," I continued, "that nothing illegal occurred. All filings are compliant. All acquisitions appropriately disclosed. You simply didn't read them. It was the truth, buried in footnotes, appendices, and vendor chains they considered beneath them. Celia made sure of that. I reached for the stack of resolutions. "Today, we'll be voting on the dissolution of certain roles," I said, flipping to the marked page. "I've taken the liberty of preparing exit packages, generous ones, because I wasn't there to humiliate them, just to end them, professionally, surgically, irrevocably." A few tried to posture, to argue. They cited bylaws and precedent, using the very tools they'd once weaponized against me. I let them talk, because nothing rattles arrogance like watching it echo in a room where it no longer matters. When they finished, Marcus slid a final document forward. "Here's the clause you missed," he said. "Section 8.4, Emergency Board Reconstitution upon transfer of controlling interest. Executed Friday. In effect now." More silence. Then Mark said very quietly, "So what happens now?" I looked around the room. The crest on the carpet, the empty chair at the end, the one they never offered me. "I suggest you gather your things," I said. "There's a new table being built, and none of your names are on it." They didn't go quietly. Men like that never do. They don't rage, not right away. First they rationalize. Then they question the process. Then they blame the formatting of the documents. Then, when the dust starts to settle and the floor is undeniably no longer theirs, they demand an audit. "To ensure compliance," Henry had said, voice tight, jaw clenched, "as is our fiduciary duty." What he meant was, he wanted to find something, a crack, a misstep, a paper misfiled, something to prove that a woman like me couldn't have outmaneuvered them legally, cleanly, flawlessly. So I gave them the audit. Not because I had to, but because I wanted them to see it, line by line, clause by clause, the architecture of their own obsolescence. Celia coordinated the response, each file delivered in triplicate, digitally watermarked, every page time-stamped. It wasn't just airtight, it was suffocating. The audit firm, an outside group chosen to avoid claims of internal bias, sent 2 men and 1 woman. She led the team. Her name was Desiree. She arrived 15 minutes early, requested black coffee and a copy of the building's blueprints. "I like knowing the shape of the system I'm evaluating," she said, eyes scanning the lobby like it might reveal a hidden weakness. She reviewed everything: ownership ledgers, vendor contracts, bylaws amended and legally notarized 2 years prior. Every transaction matched. Every valuation held. Every acquisition was layered, disclosed, and reconciled. "I've never seen anything quite like it," she said on day 3. "This isn't just compliant, it's predictive." That was the word I'd been waiting for. Because I hadn't built Evergreen to react. I'd built it to preempt. Every angle considered. Every variable modeled. Every possible attempt at sabotage anticipated before they even knew it would occur. But the audit wasn't just about legality. It was about legacy. It unearthed more than they expected. And not on my side. They found expense accounts charged with dinners that weren't business-related. Contracts awarded to friends of friends with no competitive bidding. Licensing agreements that expired 2 years ago, still billed monthly. And emails. So many emails. Especially from Mark. Dozens of back-channel messages to a vendor whose name also appeared on his brother-in-law's LinkedIn page. Invoices padded. Payments split between accounts. Marcus flagged it gently in the audit summary. Potential exposure. Recommend internal investigation. They tried to bury that part. Suddenly the audit was inconclusive. The conclusions were premature. The data manipulated. But Desiree didn't flinch. She uploaded the full report to a secure shareholder portal. Stamped. Signed. Immutable. They couldn't hide it. Couldn't dispute what they'd never bothered to read the first time. One by one, they began to fade. Resignations framed as personal transitions. LinkedIn updates about new chapters. A few tried to spin it as a pivot, a sabbatical, a fellowship, a startup that somehow didn't exist the week prior. But their exits weren't stories. They were consequences, and I didn't need to say a word. The document spoke louder than outrage ever could. What they didn't understand, what they never understood, is that power is not about title or tenure, or even who talks the most in a meeting. Power is about proof, ownership, documentation. I didn't win because I was angry. I won because I had receipts. They had opinions. I had contracts. And when the final audit meeting concluded, when Desiree slid the last folder into her briefcase and turned to me with a nod, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. The war they never knew they started was over. The records were closed. The story now had footnotes, all of them traceable. I walked them out of the building, the same lobby where I once waited for elevators that wouldn't stop for my floor. Celia stood beside me, arms crossed, watching them retreat. "Will they recover?" I asked quietly. "Eventually," she said, "but not from the fact that you never raised your voice." And it arrived on a Thursday morning. Not with fanfare, not with applause, just a simple delivery slip and a woman named Vera who wheeled it through the lobby like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was mine. Mahogany, hand-finished, wide arms, upholstered in soft graphite leather, not black, because black was too obvious, too expected. A deep gray, cool and unbothered, powerful in the way silence is powerful. On the back, a brass plaque, no title, no initials, just a single phrase, unreturned, unrelenting. I had written those words months before, alone in my loft, when the purchase contracts were still unsigned, and my name was still misspelled on email chains. It wasn't a quote. It wasn't even meant to be seen. It was a promise. To myself, to the girl who used to wait for recognition, to the woman who no longer needed it. They say revenge is best served cold, but this wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. The chair was installed at the head of the table, the same table where, years before, I'd once stood behind someone else's seat, holding someone else's water, waiting for someone else to acknowledge my presence. No one asked why the chair was different. They noticed, of course. Noticed its height, its depth, its design. But no one asked, because by then, asking meant admitting. Admitting they'd been outrun, outmaneuvered, outlasted. I didn't sit in it immediately. For the first few days, I continued using one of the standard conference chairs. Ergonomic, beige, forgettable. I wanted the distance. I wanted the air to settle, to watch the weight of the room shift toward the chair even when it was empty. Power, I'd learned, isn't just about what you hold. It's about what others feel in your presence. And sometimes, absence is the heaviest thing in the room. Eventually, I sat, not during a big meeting, not during a quarterly review, just a Tuesday strategy session with a few new directors and Celia beside me, taking notes like she always did. Except now, her title read, Chief of Staff. The moment I sat, the conversation changed. The tone sharpened. The posture around the table corrected itself. Ideas came slower, but more carefully. No one tried to talk over me. No one cut me off mid-sentence, because this time they knew better. They weren't just talking to the new CEO, they were talking to the owner. They asked about expansion, about partnerships, about international licensing. I listened. I asked questions. I offered a single correction, softly but with surgical clarity. And when the meeting ended, no one lingered. No side conversations. No, let's circle back. Just nods. And silence. After they left, Celia placed a small envelope on the table. "What's this?" I asked. "A letter," she said. "You wrote it 5 years ago. Told me not to give it to you until you earned that chair." I stared at it. It was yellowed, unsealed. I opened it slowly, half expecting to find a long manifesto. Instead, 5 words. "Don't shrink now. Expand." Completely. I smiled, because I remembered the version of myself who had written it. A little exhausted, a little afraid, but precise, unwilling to leave without finishing the arc. That letter stayed in the drawer beneath the plaque, not for sentiment, but for memory, because the world will always try to convince women like me that the chair isn't ours. That ownership must come with compromise. That presence requires permission. But I had proven otherwise, in 12 shell companies, in 3 offshores, in 1 irrevocable shift in the center of gravity. The chair was never the victory. The chair was just the evidence. The real win was this. They couldn't erase me, because I had become foundational. The walls would fall before I did, and it was faint at first, muted, polite. Applause coming from the boardroom down the hall, not mine. They were hosting a leadership symposium, one of those annual performances where panelists discussed innovation like it was a game, and diversity like it was a slogan. The room was full, not of power, but of people who still believed proximity to it meant participation. I watched through the glass wall, unseen from the mezzanine above. Same faces, same scripts, same tired metaphors about climbing ladders and breaking ceilings, offered with the fervor of those who had never once looked down to see who steadied the ladder for them. A woman was speaking, one I recognized. She had once told me to focus on being invaluable before being visible. At the time, I believed her. I made myself indispensable, worked harder, stayed later, accepted less, and still, visibility never came, until I stopped asking for it. That room, the one echoing with applause, was never meant for me. Not really. Even now, as owner, I wasn't invited. My name wasn't on the program. No mention of Evergreen. No acknowledgement of the acquisition that had quietly rewritten the org chart behind their curtain of curated optimism. I thought for a moment about walking in. Not to disrupt, just to be seen. Just to let the silence crack under the weight of realization. But I didn't. Because the room that once rejected me wasn't worthy of the version of me I had become. Their applause was performative, reflexive, echoed by the same hands that once erased women like me from minutes, from budgets, from succession plans. Let them clap. Let them celebrate titles while I controlled the signatures beneath them. So I turned away. Back to the floor that mattered. My floor. Where decisions weren't announced with hashtags but made with wire transfers. Where influence wasn't measured by panel invites, but by the number of people whose fates were now quietly tied to mine. The irony didn't escape me. For years, I had chased that room, tried to contort myself to fit its angles, learn its dialect, mimic its tempo. And now, having outgrown it entirely, I could see it clearly for what it was. A decoy. A spectacle for those who confused applause with authority. In my office, the only sound was the soft click of a fountain pen. Celia, drafting a transition memo. 3 more executives had submitted resignations that morning. Their exit emails were vague. Their LinkedIn statuses updated before noon. I had given them grace. They didn't know how to handle it. Celia looked up. They asked if you'd like to close the symposium with a few words. I raised an eyebrow. Words? I said. I already gave them the documents. What's left to say? She smirked. They think it would be meaningful. To who? To them. That was the problem. Everything was always for them. The speeches, the scripts, the recognition, designed to soothe those who'd once built walls around inclusion, and now wanted credit for painting the walls a different color. No, I said. Let them finish their little ceremony. What should I tell them? I turned back to my window, watching the room from above, not in contempt, but in clarity. Tell them the owner had other meetings. And the lobby hadn't changed. Same marble floors, same hushed conversations between assistants, same front desk, where new visitors were still greeted with polite indifference unless they wore the right suit, the right watch, the right last name. But I had changed. And now, I stood in that same lobby, not waiting for an elevator, not adjusting my posture to look confident, but watching, just watching. There was a young woman at the reception desk, early 20s, nervous, clutching a manila folder the way I used to hold my resume, like it held proof of worth. She wore sensible shoes. She'd brushed her hair into a neat bun. She kept checking the time. I saw myself in her, and I saw the game she was about to walk into. The receptionist gave her that same look I'd received years ago, the one that scanned you for value before you'd even spoken. She smiled through it, polite, careful. She didn't know yet that she was being evaluated before she'd even entered the room. I stepped forward. The receptionist straightened. "Can I help?" "It's fine," I said, nodding toward the girl. "She's with me." The girl blinked. "I'm sorry, You're early," I said. "That's good. Come with me." No one stopped us. Not because they recognized me, the woman who once stood invisible in the back of this very building, but because now I didn't walk with hope. I walked with certainty. We took the elevator to the top floor. The ride was silent. She looked at the mirrored doors, avoided eye contact. I remembered that feeling too, not wanting to take up too much space in someone else's world. When we reached the suite, Celia opened the door. The young woman hesitated, then stepped inside. "I wasn't expecting," she started. "I know," I said. "I thought this was an interview for a temp role." "It was," I replied, sitting behind the desk with the chair, my chair, beneath me. "But I've rewritten the org chart." She blinked. "I don't understand." "You don't have to. Just sit. Let's talk about your ideas. Not your resume." She sat. We talked. And for the first time in her life, someone listened to her as if she were already in the room she was trying to enter, because I remembered what it felt like to offer ideas into the void, to wait for someone to say, "You belong here." But now I didn't wait. I made the space. Later that afternoon, I walked back to the lobby, alone, no fanfare. There was a gala that night, another charity function in the ballroom downstairs, the same one where they'd once called me a nobody. The event director stopped me at the entrance. "I'm sorry," she said. "This area is closed to vendors until—" I raised an eyebrow. She faltered. Then she saw it. The pin. Subtle. Brass. Evergreen's mark. Not available in stores. Not even listed on staff directories. Her eyes widened. "Oh, I didn't realize." "No need," I said, brushing past. The ballroom was lit in gold. Crystals sparkled. Laughter floated through champagne bubbles, and the people applauded as a man gave a speech about opportunity and resilience. I smiled. Not because I wanted to join them, but because I no longer needed to. I had my own applause. It came from documents signed in silence, from names no longer listed, from women walking into rooms behind me, not as interns, but as architects. They once called me a nobody, but now when they enter the building, they walk on floors I paid for, under ceilings I raised, through doors I rebuilt, wider this time, and I don't need them to know it. I just need them to keep walking through.